Hey guys, welcome, small merry band of the FGC remnant within Portland Retro Gaming. So I'm Steve Hendershot, I'm a journalist from Chicago, and last year I wrote the book Undisputed Street Fighter, the 30th anniversary retrospective, and last Christmas it came out. But we'll start in February of last year. We were in the hospital. This is my wife, Claire.
My wife.
She gave birth to our second child, and that night, after a lot of talk and negotiation and discussion, the contract finally came through to write the Street Fighter book, like full-length, deep dive, in 4 months. So it was like, all right, sleepless parenthood time, and also we're going to go for it. I'm going to interview everybody I could possibly interview. So immediately set out to interview both. I wanted to tell the FGC side of the story, the players that have made this game special, as well as the development side. So I started out on this side of the Pacific, talking to as many of the Capcom US folks as I could, while I tried to work through Capcom to get to the folks in Capcom Japan, especially those behind Street Fighter 2. It took a long time to finally get that permission. There was like a moment when Yoshinori Ono, who was then running the fighting game group at Capcom, came to San Francisco, and I went there and interviewed him, but it was unclear whether I would get to the two masterminds, both named Akiri Nishitani and Akira Yasuda, that were behind Street Fighter 2, and then finally, very late in the process, maybe early May, and when the deadline was late May, I finally got the call, you can go to Japan now. The reason for this was not Akira Nishitani, who has grown up from the precocious game designer behind Street Fighter 2 into a responsible adult who owns a gaming studio. The reason was Akira Akiman Yasuda, the artist and character designer, who turns out to be a quirky guy. We're not sure if you fly to Japan, if he will let you in that day, but finally they decided it was worth the risk. So I got to Japan. I started in Osaka, in the Capcom storeroom. The art floor, the Street Fighter art floor at Capcom is remarkably sterile and corporate feeling, and the stockroom in back is just metal shelving, fluorescent lights, banker's boxes out of cardboard with all this stuff that was ho-hum to them, and they start pulling out images like this Street Fighter Alpha key art on the left. That's my iPhone photo of it as an acrylic painting on canvas, and the way they used to do it is when the artists would finish with their actual game design. So once the game was out the door, their reward would be for the next 3 weeks they would paint the game, and basically that would turn into the marketing materials. So same artists, but when they were done dotting, they would do these acrylics. Those are all just back there in the storeroom, and it was the first cool moment to just sort of hold all the stuff and feel like I'd found the treasure trove. But then I took the bullet train back to Tokyo, and I met in the lobby of Capcom Tokyo Shoei, I always want to say Shoei Otani now because it's a baseball player, but Shoei Okano, the one Capcom employee who was an artist in the 80s when the Street Fighter franchise was kicking off and is still there. And then also Nakayama-san, who's the Street Fighter 5 producer, was sort of walking to Akiman's house, and I could tell as we were going that Shoei was getting more and more nervous, even though I couldn't technically understand anything that was happening. And it was that Akiman was not answering. And then finally he gets the call, and we immediately change course, and we go into a department store on the other side of town to get a vegetable smoothie that he has requested. Yeah, you can come if you bring me the smoothie. So we get the smoothie, then we go to 7-Eleven. Then finally, we get to Yasuda-san's house, which is over there on the right, just inside. I mean, it's a small place. You walk inside, and his OCDs on display. There are hundreds of yen coins stacked in towers just inside the door, and there's a little kitchenette. It's a really small Tokyo apartment. There's a small studio off to the side. There's a kitchen. There's this, you can see the mess behind Chun-Li there, this oil painting of Chun-Li that he made just a couple of years ago for a show. That's his bed is back there. Some weird Japanese porn framed in the wall. And then in front, there's the big TV. His fighting game paradise, his Overwatch game was paused there. And then there's a semicircle of character statues, some of which were his. There was a Sakura there, some of which were otherwise. So we all sit down. The tea is poured, and we begin this 3.5-hour interview. And I'm like, all right, we're finally going to get to the secret sauce of Street Fighter. And then quickly I remembered that I have no idea whether to tell whether this is the secret sauce or not because he's answering in Japanese. And I would ask, I had the detailed deep dive list of questions to ask Akiman. And so I would ask them, and Noriko Matsunaga, my interpreter slash host from Capcom USA, would ask him, and he would talk for 10 minutes. And then she would say, he doesn't really remember that episode clearly. So it wasn't until I got back to Chicago that I sent the Nishitani interview and the Yasuda interview off to get translated, get the transcriptions and translations back. And I realized, yes, they were answering my questions. They were doing so well. Here's all the stuff. And what was interesting, and we're going to talk about today, is the extent to which I realized after traveling to Japan to get the inside scoop on this Japanese game that, to a great extent, what makes Street Fighter unique and sets it apart, certainly from other fighting games. Specifically, you've got this sort of hyper-Japanese series, Tekken, and then the American series made in our hometown of Chicago, Mortal Kombat. That Street Fighter's unique spin is that it is very much a result of a conversation between Japan and America. So we'll talk today about a few of the ways that this sort of East meets West influence resulted in Street Fighter as we know it. We'll stop a few times along the way to take questions too. Title page. So the first bit of East-West conversation is an inspiration for the game, and this is, as a creative, pains me to say this, but the creative process starts with a meddlesome CEO from Capcom giving heavy-handed micromanaging orders to his creatives. Capcom's founder, Kenzo Sugimoto, loved movies, and he told his game designers that he wanted movies with a cinematic feel, but very specifically he named some of his favorite movies. So there had been rumors when I started this project that Street Fighter was called Street Fighter because it was chasing some specific target. And in fact, there was a movie called The Street Fighter that had come out in America in the mid-'70s, and I watched it. I had read an article that said this was the inspiration, and it made no sense. I mean, it was violent. There was kicking and punching, but that was really the only connection between that film and the game that I could see. But finally, so I'm in Yasuda's Akiman's apartment. Again, this is a 3.5-hour conversation that I'm essentially not listening to because it's happening in Japanese. And then finally, I hear in the middle of one of my answers about the movie question, Charles Bronson. File that one away, look it up when I get home. And it turns out that there was this movie called The Street Fighter, so released in the UK and in Japan. But because of that other movie in the US, the title in America was changed to Hard Times. But what is the plot of this movie? If we know Street Fighter, Charles Bronson plays a bare-knuckled brawler who drifts from town to town, and at the beginning of the movie arrives in New Orleans. And pretty much the plot is he's like a stoic guy who's in it for nothing but the glory of the fight, and the plot unfolds as he fights several people with different fighting styles in front of colorful backdrops that evoke different aspects of New Orleans history. It's the plot of Street Fighter, except isolated to New Orleans. So this original game really does chase Sugimoto's vision to make it cinematic and to chase this very specific American film. And then before we move on, so Street Fighter 1 then comes out and Akiman and Nishitani are not involved. This first game is interesting because of how much it gets right and also how that somehow turns out to be not as compelling as you might think. So in terms of what we now know fighting games to be, they essentially come up with the 6-button and joystick system that we now know, despite serious opposition. In fact, this is the original Street Fighter cabinet. It was designed by another guy that I got to interview, Ken Hata, who worked for Atari. So they went to Atari, and not only did they say we want to, people are going to freak out with six buttons. You need to make a 2-button game. So he comes up with these he made the cabinet. The idea for the pressure-sensitive buttons came from Japan, but these 2 buttons, like a light press gets you light punch, medium, fierce requires you to be fierce with the cabinet. They actually built, for the American release of the game, thicker plywood cabinets on the theory that violent American players would break the cabinet. They didn't really break the cabinet, but the hydraulic pipes did keep detaching, and then literally people were hurting themselves, breaking fingers and things like that. So they moved away from the 2-button cabinet to the 6-button thing. But if you think about it, so they do that. Ryu is introduced. They come up with some sweet special moves. You have Ryu fighting a fairly ordinary cast of very human and very not Blanca or Honda, etc., but like normal cast of baddies, but the Hadoken is introduced, the Shoryuken is introduced. There's another bit of random trivia. There was another move called the fire kick, where fire comes out of Ryu's toe. and they realized after they had finished the game in this era, this is 87, like all the individual cells were coded before all of those frames were sort of combined into final moves. And so once all the animation in the game was sort of hardwired, they decided that the fire kick was dumb. So they needed to make a new move, and the Tetsumaki Senpukyaku, the spinning kick, was literally just made up out of the spare parts when the fire kick was rejected. So Street Fighter 1 somehow was like more and less than the sum of its parts. It was an interesting game. It was good enough to inspire a sequel. It was also good enough that the two developers behind Nishiyama-san and Matsumoto-san that created Street Fighter 1 for Capcom were poached by HOK on the south side of Osaka, so they ended up creating King of Fighters and all of its sequels that sort of follow the very Japanese vibe of Street Fighter 1. And so the Capcom folks, there's another look at Ken Hata's prototypes of that original Street Fighter 1 cabinet.
Yes.
And before we move on, I just figured I'd point out that CEO interference in the creative process isn't always smart. Tsuchimoto's love of movies continued to present itself. So this is a result of that. We could all do without. You and Jean-Claude.
Such studios Swan Song.
Yes, yes, exactly. So I learned he was really, really sick through the making of this movie. They had to sort of take breaks, bring it back. Also, there's a complete side note that is not on track for my outline, but assuming you want all the Street Fighter trivia that you might want, here's more of it. So, Mortal Kombat comes from Midway in Chicago, and Street Fighter recognizes this is its great rival. And we'll talk later about the movie when, with no concept of branding, they essentially start designing 9 Street Fighter sequels or Street Fighter branded games with no connection to one another. But so even as they're developing Alpha and Street Fighter 3, they decide to chase Mortal Kombat with this live action motion capture Street Fighter, the movie, the game. The first awesome thing there is that they must assume that those things come from Chicago, so they go to another Chicago studio that's not Midway, that's got live action expertise. It's the folks behind Golden Tee. But then secondly, and I say this as a Chicagoan who knows a lot of the actors behind the characters in Mortal Kombat, they are martial artists. They know what they're doing, and Kylie Minogue does not. And Raul Julia, God bless him, was on his deathbed. I mean, there were serious issues. Only Jean-Claude was really able to... the Golden Tee guys are quick to remind that, like, we were behind the 8 ball here. It was not an equal footing to make our own Mortal Kombat game. So, all right, back to it. So, there's the inspiration. Let's move on to how feedback from America influenced Street Fighter in a couple ways. And the first one is the game Street Fighter 1989, which was later released as Final Fight. So here are the two guys I mentioned earlier. This is Akira Yasuda on the left and Akira Nishitani on the right. I think Akiman was 19 and Nishitani-san was 21 when they get the Street Fighter gig. But at first, they get the reins for the Street Fighter sequel when the other two guys leave across town. At first, they're young, there's a lot of oversight, the CEO is lurking, Okamoto-san, the sort of head of games division, is also lurking, and they start building out Street Fighter 2, pretty similar to the World Warrior, the Street Fighter 2 that we all know. But then a global chip famine strikes, which means there's not enough silicon to go around. I mean, it would become cross-prohibitive to use as much sort of chip space as they had planned for Street Fighter 2, and they were planning this ambitious game where, unlike the original Street Fighter, where you could only play as Ryu and Ken existed as the color swap, they wanted you to be able to play each of the 8 characters from World Warrior. They were planning this more intensive game, and suddenly it wasn't going to be possible to do that. So they had to either decide to strip it back or make another game with the assets that they had begun to pull together. So instead, they make Street Fighter 1989 or Final Fight. So first fun tip is that Final Fight really does belong in the Street Fighter canon. It's a Nishitani Yasuda special. It's a side-scrolling beat-em-up a la Double Dragon. But in several ways, it paves the way for Street Fighter, not least because it did pretty well. So what was going to be a game that was made by a 21-year-old and a 19-year-old with a lot of oversight from their bosses because it was a big-budget project, suddenly because of Final Fight, they get free reign. But Final Fight itself does a couple other interesting things. Another movie poster. another film by the same guy, Walter Hill, that you either know as the director of 48 Hours, if you're more of a mainstream type, or if you're more indie, you know him as the director of The Warriors. He's got this interesting style, and there's another movie he makes that Tsujimoto also likes a lot. And it's really interesting because we talked before about Street the Fighter. This movie, if you say it in Japanese, is like Streets of Fighter. I mean, they sound so alike. So this one comes out like 1984. And just from a like 80s movie fan's perspective, it's fascinating. The cast was almost super awesome. Like it's one of the debuts for Diane Lane, Willem Dafoe, Rick Moranis is involved. But on the right there, so that's Diane Lane on the left, on the right is Michael Paré, who got the gig over Tom Cruise in a coin flip of like next big male action star, except it didn't work out that way for Michael Paré. The movie was a hit in Japan, so these are all like, both of these movies essentially, Hard Times and Streets of Fire are like big Japanese movies where they're sort of trying to make these games to appeal to a Western audience, and so we've got this American inspiration, but these movies weren't that popular, so I'm not sure that the American audience, years later when the fighting games arrive, understand the degree to which these are homages. But the plot of Streets of Fire is that you've got a good guy whose blonde girlfriend is stolen by a highly stylized motorcycle gang. In the first scene, they ride across town, and then he has to fight his way across town to get her back. That is also the plot of Final Fight. And so the movie itself is inspiration, but I also like that Akiman begins to demonstrate his care for quirky characters that are like fearsome, but also just really, pretty playful and really interesting in a way that you did not see in Street Fighter 1, and that goes on to be a hallmark of the series and what makes Street Fighter full of iconic characters. So you think about, and I'll give you a little background on these characters straight from Akiman. The good guy, Cody, who you may know from various Street Fighter titles, except he's somehow not a good guy these days, but those are the natures of video games and soap operas. But Cody is also the protagonist in the movie, so we'll write him off as like a direct lift. But Mike Hagar, the mayor, who's like a giant wrestler-looking dude who picks up clubs and fights his way across town. Akiman had just read Les Mis and thought having a mayor who was also a strong man was just a cool idea, so he went with it. Sodom, you have this football helmet wearing samurai, and he was just sort of filling this fun Japanese image of the white American who wishes he was a cool martial artist, but we all know he's posing. Put that in the game. Andre the Giant is in the game, just because Andre the Giant. And so the constellation of characters in this game, it just departs from what we had seen either from a Double Dragon type scenario or any of the earlier fighting games, not just Street Fighter 1, but Karate Champ, etc. So the training wheels come out, and then we move on to, last point with Final Fight is that Nishitani comes to America to play test the game in US arcades. And as he does so, he notices that American arcade audiences are playing Street Fighter 1, which is, they're still machines. I think it was Southern Hills Golfland in Los Angeles where this happens.
Rest in peace.
Rest in peace. So he watches the American players interacting with Street Fighter 1, and like people are lined up, people are watching over the shoulder. There's this like person-to-person battle that we now know is essentially the essence of fighting games. But this is not how the game was getting played in Japan. They had put player versus player in Street Fighter 1 as like a sort of gimmicky, this is technically possible and we could theoretically get more quarters if people were playing each other, but it was a gimmicky add-on and it was not well received in Japan. And one of the reasons we're seeing right here is this is Street Fighter 4 play. I surreptitiously took the shot in a Tokyo arcade last year because you're not allowed to photograph anyone, but I wanted to highlight this. Like those guys are not playing each other. The way that all the Japanese fighting game consoles, or I should say arcade cabs, are set up, is that you are playing someone on the other side of the aisle that you can't see. And this was essentially the opposite of the King of the Arcade vibe that America was building. And so I don't have that American shot. There's a random FGC back in the day with Joey Cuellar and John Choi and Alex Valle back there at the top right looking on. But this sort of crowd watching around the two players, jostling, maybe elbowing each other, this is like the way that fighting games developed in America. And the fact that Nishitani saw this changed everything. So he went back to Japan, and suddenly player versus player went from something he was considering dropping from Street Fighter II to the center of it all. And then the character design. So as we move into Street Fighter II, Akimon quickly begins doing the same sort of cleverness with his Street Fighter II cast. And he does this in a way, I feel like we've got to talk in 2018 about like the gross stereotypes that are involved in his attempts to think through all the world warriors, including, you know, he didn't know about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so monster. But here again, speaking of the monster, Blanca, the Amazon. So I'm not really sure this qualifies as East meets West then, but this is a great bit of trivia, so I just need to share it. Nishitani and Yasuda, during the long break, the sort of Final Fight era break, when they're thinking through Street Fighter II, they played a lot of Nintendo Pro Wrestling. And when Akimon thinks through characters, he's always thinking not just through the visual, you know, sort of profile of the new character and the fighting style, but, you know, the specific move set and how and I don't mean that from a game balance perspective, I mean sort of like the way the character looks and moves help them occupy a sort of certain aspect in the roster. And he's always thinking about how does that pair with the rest of the constellation. So there's this game balance thing where he's always sort of like looking for the balancing character. So they played Nintendo Pro Wrestling, and he loved this dynamic between the smooth, elegant character Starman on the right and the character the Amazon, Fishman, on the left. And what he loved is that the Starman was so elegant and smooth and unflappable in almost all his matches, but he thought it was hilarious when he would get bit by the Fishman. I'm like, isn't it just kind of awesome that he can't handle the sort of feral rawness of this creature and his elegance goes out the window, and he wanted to bring that to the game. So it's fairly easy looking at this to see, oh yeah, I can see Blanca in the Amazon just a little bit, both in their place of origin and in their wildness and in their color scheme. But Starman actually was equally a part of that. That's pixelated. But Starman is Guile. The Guile, you know, like it doesn't make a ton of sense. Obviously, there's no visual connection, but Guile was the idea. This is 1985. There was no one cooler than Sylvester Stallone, so you create a Rambo-type character, and that is the epitome of the smooth, unflappable action hero. That is the natural foil to Blanca. So, you have a question?
Well, I'm just thinking,
Yeah.
the upside down kicks make a lot of sense now with Guile, because, you know, Starman down A.
That's a fine point. Back to the, this is interesting, just kind of a branding point. I was listening to Tim Lapatino a couple of sessions ago talk about the IP and just how you could do anything with Pac-Man in 1983. And then gradually, you know, the legal world has evolved where you must be much more respectful of the characters. So this is a Dalsum that I just think is awesome. It's one of the things that we had created for the deluxe edition of Undisputed Street Fighter. But it was also crazy as we, in a minute, get to the various iterations of Street Fighter II and then Alpha and how just like freewheeling the Street Fighter properties were back then. I mean, at some point Nishitani left Capcom and started his own polygon-based fighting game with nothing to do with anything. And then he called Okamoto, his old boss at Capcom, and wanted to show him the new game. And Okamoto was like, yeah, this is awesome. You should just make it a Street Fighter. So that's where Street Fighter EX had its roots, just like he wanted to be encouraging, and he's like, I bet I can help you by lending my billion-dollar brand name. Done. But now, it's funny, in the making of these various images, we kept getting feedback, like non-lingual feedback from Capcom that would just like circle an area where you missed some core essence of like, Chun-Li's bracelet needs to have 3 spikes, not 2, or something like that. It's a different world now in terms of how tightly IP'd these characters are, but I just wanted to throw Dalsum up here as another example of one of those fantastic Akimon creations that in one way is extremely not PC in such a gross, it's not even a gross stereotype, it's like an actual nonsensical stereotype, but he'd never been to India, he doesn't know, and yet like played well on the screen, and just by letting his imagination run wild, again, it's not just about the Indian yogi, but I mean, I remember asking him like, sort of getting at this, do you feel awkward about it now? And he was like, no, I don't, because my characters are interesting and everybody else's characters are not interesting. But then also, He's like, yeah, I mean, I was 19. I knew two things about India, that they ate spicy food, so I figured he could breathe fire, and that like yoga makes you stretchy, so why not? But the genius of the genius of Akiman then is like not just to indulge those ideas, but to take them to their absolute extreme. So now we've got, I can spit fire, and I don't know where the teleporting comes from, but like for me as a like middle schooler encountering, is that right? 10-year-old, whatever grade that puts you in, as I encountered Street Fighter 2 for the first time, that's what I noticed is like, I couldn't make the fireball happen. It was Dalsim's normals that you could punch across the screen. I was like, what is this game? And you know, a bunch of those choices led to Street Fighter 2's uniqueness. So, second part of feedback, let's fast forward a year or two. Now Street Fighter 2 is on the market. In fact, Champion Edition is on the market. This is like the game that everyone in the world is playing, especially in America. And it was music to the ears of Nishitani that there were opportunities to continue to release iterations of this game because, as you know, the chess-like complexity of Street Fighter, he just felt like he wasn't done. He wasn't endlessly nerfing and buffing characters for the sake of torturing the FGC, but he was trying to get to a perfect version of Street Fighter, and so he had sort of made these small balance tweaks. Nobody was going to greenlight another game for those. So when other people said, hey, this is blowing up in America, what else can we do? They want to play the bosses. They want to play, you know, I've got too many girls in the arcade dressed as Chun-Li. It's causing problems that only one of them can be Chun-Li. So that begets Champion Edition. But then you get these two things. So a knockoff arcade cabinet shows up with a Chun-Li has a fireball now. Sonic booms are wobbling across the screen, and the game is way faster. So Capcom, in the name of due diligence, sends one of their US staffers, James Goddard, to check this out at the arcade. He plays all day, and he's like, the balance is junk. This is not a game that poses a serious threat to Street Fighter. This is what he types up in his report that day. And then, fortunately, you couldn't email things in those days, so he just typed up the report, and it was on his desk, and then he went to the cafeteria room to play a little Street Fighter before he went home just to wind down, and he played Champion Edition, and it was like playing in quicksand, and he then realized we have a serious problem on our hands. So it was that bit of feedback back to Japan that sort of set things on the right track. This is what gets interesting here is that, so the Japanese team, I don't know how, so Nishitani at this point is like semi-involved in Street Fighter. He and Yasuda actually both have been transferred on to a new property thanks to the licensing deal that Capcom saw. So they're off in the corner working on X-Men Children of the Atom, which is essentially Street Fighter 2 with the X-Men. And the remaining Street Fighter team is adding 4 characters, the Super Street Fighter 2, so Cammy, Fei Long, T-Hawk, and DJ, to the game. Some other small balance challenges, but they're making Super Street Fighter Turbo. They don't like this suggestion that they need to speed up the game. They go ask Nishitani, he agrees, like, no, more speed is going to wreck Street Fighter. And they do it only to appease American marketing. So, Hyper Fighting comes out, which is Street Fighter 2 sped up. Chun-Li has a fireball. But meanwhile, the Japanese team wants none of this, so they proceed with Super Street Fighter 2 on a separate track, and that game gets released, and it's the first flop in the Street Fighter line, even though it's I believe that was the first game released on this upgraded hardware. This was supposed to be like the Street Fighter 2.5, and everyone's ignoring it in the arcade. And so I just like this story because you get this combination of purest creative vision from Japan and market-driven arcade feedback from the US. And there's resistance between those two things, as there often is between creative projects that are closely held, and yet ultimately they smash those two things together. The failure of Super Street Fighter 2 convinces the Japan team to speed things up and add the hyper fighting speed and tricks into the gameplay, and out of all that we get Super Turbo, which in some ways the market was already getting tired of Street Fighter 2. It's sort of like a moment of inspiring Jean-Claude Van Damme movies was over, but from a creative achievement point, this is the pinnacle, right? This is maybe the oldest game that's still inspires highly competitive top-level tournament play. We're glad as a civilization that they had to come to that compromise, and it was only due to a combination of sort of stubborn sticking to their guns in Japan and stubborn insistence that they stick to other guns coming from America, and finally, when the like proper compromise got struck, they sort of created the ultimate game in the Street Fighter canon. So, before we get into the visual style, any questions at this point about either what I've talked about or really anything? Because I have a lot of Street Fighter trivia. Yeah.
There's actually an old movie, this is in regards to Dulcie. There's an old movie, the one-armed boxer, and there's a, grossly racist Indian stereotype in it, but he has, long extending arms.
Shows that the match with the flag guillotine too.
Okay.
I'm using guillotine.
Guillotine was. I saw it like last week.
Okay, all right.
Nice.
Direct sequel to the movie, so it makes sense, but.
It would not shock me. I mean, so some of these ideas are original, some of these pulling from, yeah.
Yeah, but my question was, like, Akimi had not mentioned this movie, or?
It is possible in these transcripts. I don't want to like say that he did not give it any credit, and he was in other places. I mean, it was an interesting interview because there were also moments like I was asking about Bison, who was wondering about those roots, and it turns out that there's both a manga and like a show from the 80s in Japan that he's very much like visually based on. And it's not that Akiman was dodging it, but he was sort of like floating out with various influences. I think I remember a show, I think I remember that. And then meantime, Nakayama-san is like Googling this character and turning the computer to me, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's Bison. And then Akiman would be like, yeah, I guess that's Bison. Although, again, and I guess what you're saying about Dalsum sort of is in step with this, but Akiman's construct of the character is both kind of like the visual set as well as the like corresponding behaviors and the character that is sort of opposite. But if that's true, I bet you anything was an influence. It sounds right to me based on everything that I know about his creative process. Yeah?
Is there anything to the name change between Balrog and Bison from Japan to America?
Yeah, I mean, everything you think is true is true. I can tell the story for anybody who doesn't know that story, but like...
It's pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, that's what happened. It's a last-minute marketing switch. And to the point where, I mean, still, the names are
They're still switched.
unswitched in other places, and so inside Capcom, they just get called Dictator, Claw, etc. Yeah.
What you said about the versus mode becoming like a forefront feature in Street Fighter 2, I was curious, in Japan, did they alter the cabinet design where there were actually player versus player standing next to each other? Is still doing that across the aisle that you mentioned?
Yeah, so I don't know, because obviously at the time, I don't know if they took, I mean, no single machine existed to facilitate player versus player across, so they must have put them together. And I remember James Goddard talking about this kind of like showdown moment where they sent him to Japan, and then the Japanese team tried to kind of poo-poo his suggestions, and he was like, let's go watch it at the arcade. And they're like, so they're on the way over to the arcade, and they're all warning him, we don't want you to be disappointed. We think you're a promising young employee, and just because you're totally wrong about this doesn't mean that you're a bad person. And then, I mean, I'm getting this from him, mind you, so he looks very good in the way I'm about to tell the story, and I wasn't there, so maybe there's another side. But he's like, we got to the arcade, and we're like, what's that group of people smiling and clapping over in the corner? And it was the people watching head-to-head Street Fighter play, like for the first time, and it was, the level of play had been raised, and that also might have been when they were playing the sped-up version. All right, so the hybrid visual style, some of the Akiman sketches of Street Fighter 2 characters, we already talked about some of the origins and some of the stereotypes. It's interesting, Akiman actually grew up not in Tokyo, but in Hokkaido, the very far north, snowy Japan that is almost in Russia. In fact, it has, like, that town has moved back and forth between Japanese and Russian control over the years. So see Zangief there on the right, and like that's a stereotype that he had a particular relationship with, even though, Cold War, we think of, the big Russian strong-arm guy in a different way. Honda and Chun-Li are interesting. I mean, yeah. It's just, we have our own set of like prejudices and racial issues in America when you're like looking at the world through a different time period, but also through like the lens of a Japanese creator. It's like you always pay attention to how like the Chinese characters are portrayed, and then how the other Japanese characters are portrayed. Like there are their own issues, and some of the, something like Blanca is in some ways very innocent. He just had no idea and went with like whatever random stereotype he could think of. Whereas it's actually really significant in fighting games that Chun-Li exists and is awesome because she's not just a strong female character that isn't hypersexualized in that time, but also like, man, she's Chinese kung fu fighter. I mean, this is like a really surprising choice for Akiman to make. And then meantime, he also has these, like, there's a combination, everybody's kind of playful and kind of fearsome, as I mentioned, but some characters are more playful, and I think, Honda's in that category, so that is also interesting because it's a Japanese fighter, but, Ryu is like the straight man, and then Honda becomes the much more, sort of wacky Japanese character in the roster. What instantly happens when Street Fighter II gets sent to America is the American marketers are like, this game looks too Japanese, you gotta change all the art on the cabinet. Like, you don't have to mess with the actual game, but I need different stuff on the cabinet. This is not Street Fighter II, this is the Street Fighter I cabinet. I found this in an arcade in Tokyo. But you see a little bit why maybe he was not totally off base. He's, Mortal Kombat is out at this point, and he's like, I have the Rambo, G.I. Joe audience, and I need some blood and guts, and like Archie is not going to do the job. So that then leads Capcom USA to hire like one of the airbrush stars of the day, Mick McGinty, who had done he did a Rolling Stones album, I think, and a Super Bowl program at the stadium. He was an airbrush royalty, but he does all these like hyper Americanized Street Fighter art that we probably also know and love. I think this is from the Genesis version of Street Fighter 2.
Super Nintendo.
Super Nintendo, okay. But everything, like the hyper musculature, still fun. And it was interesting to talk to Mick about how much information he wasn't given about what the game was. He certainly was not given the opportunity to play the game. But he was given some like sketches of the characters and did, this sort of signature look that is Americanized. I just noticed Dawson's in the back.
What? Yeah.
Oh.
Wow. So he is.
How many times have I looked at this image?
Likewise.
All of my pictures of Jiggity magazines. I stared at this other car right back from GameStop when I was like 12. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
Jesus.
Man, who
I'm
knew?
never gonna unsee that.
Anyway, so to contrast this is another iPhone shot I took of the, this is Alpha Key Art. So this is another one of those acrylic paintings, but we also know it from packaging, but just to sort of contrast what the anime approach to Street Fighter looked at the same era. So much less in the way of sort of hyper-detailed musculature, more evocative and anime-ish, even, not playful, but sort of in this less hyper-realist mode. I show that, I just had to include it because I think it's hilarious. Back to that notion of like, back when Capcom was all over the place, throwing the Street Fighter brand name on everything. Here it is, another game I guess they thought maybe it wouldn't sell. They were like, here, make it a Street Fighter 2010. But what's funny about this era, I still, out of all the wacky truths about Street Fighter, so when they're done, Street Fighter 2 is finally put to bed. So Nishitani and Yasuda walk across the hall to work on X-Men Children of the Atom. They're waiting on the CPS-3 chip to power Street Fighter 3, but it's still a couple years off, so that game spends a long time in development. And Capcom makes the decision because they have too many CPS2 cabinets in the back. So we're not just going to throw them away. Let's make a Street Fighter out of them. So they go to their sort of youngest B-team developers, and I don't want to criticize the B-teamness of them, because Nishitani and Yasuda got their shot when they were 21 and 19, and these guys turned out to make great games. But they sort of went to their less experienced developers, handed the keys to their billion-dollar franchise, said, use all the old leftover parts in the back, and make a sort of simple Street Fighter game, and go ahead and make this one anime if you want, just to give it a different sort of prequel vibe. So we actually have the anime version of Street Fighter that gets made. It's Street Fighter Alpha. And the Street Fighter Alpha series gets remembered well, because Street Fighter Alpha 3 and 2 and all of the sort of iterations turn out well. But 1 wasn't received particularly well. It was a little broke. Capcom goes to Akiman and says, there's something wrong. What would you do? And this is the second time the character Akuma also gets created, when sort of for the need for a promotion, the boss just calls Akuma and says, we need another character. What could you do? Give me somebody in the next 10 minutes. That's where Akuma comes from. Let's get this off the screen now. They go to Akiman and say, what would you do to fix the Alpha roster? And first of all, he has an opinion because he's really irritated with the Alpha developers. He feels like the cast that they have chosen for Alpha 1 is a repudiation of his vision and his playfulness for Street Fighter 1, that they have drifted way too close to Tekken cool, and that the roster, not only in its visual treatment, but in the sorts of characters that they choose, has like lost the Street Fighter essence. So he tries to create a character not only that will like restore the game to the equilibrium of the Force, you know, that will correctly balance the Alpha universe, but also really a screw you to the Alpha team, who's like done everything that they can to make this game cooler. So he's gonna do his own Japanese schoolgirl. So Sakura, I think, is because of that. It's one of Akimon's proudest moments, and it's a moment that we don't usually associate with him with Street Fighter, because Alpha is a game that he generally didn't work a ton on, but he creates this character to balance out the game. I think she's brilliant. I mean, visually, she's this trope, but the way that she sort of functions as a I don't know how Street Fighter nerdy the audience is, so before I say broken Shoto, sort of like a version of Ken or Ryu, but that doesn't really, she can't like quite win a match in the same way that they do, so you've got to like, you know, learn a weak version of their moves, but then she can do some things that they can't, which make her unique and compelling in gameplay experience. And it's a fun moment that basically saves Alpha. And again, I don't know if that's an East meets West moment, but it's one of the sort of favorite takeaways of mine, just talking to him about the statement that she represented and the way that he thought about the other characters in the game, and how she would sort of, you know, balance that out both from a kind of cast of characters perspective and then also a gameplay perspective. And then by the time you get to Alpha 3, just notice this Japanese key art. The team, in their own still very anime-inspired way, has like come around to this hybrid style, which, by the way, continues to get refined in perspective and perfected in the Children of the Atom / Marvel vs. Capcom series. The literal superhero treatment helped Akimon and company sort of find this Eats Me Sweats style. And when I talk to some of the artists that are most moved by this, and one of the points we'll end with, but I'll just throw it out there now, you know, Overwatch, League of Legends, the Street Fighter art fanboys have gone on to create a lot of characters and a lot of great and compelling games, and so and that hybrid style that they had never seen before is something that they all point to as being influential. And you can see that even by Alpha 3, the Capcom team has come around to this, and just the musculature on boyish Ryu there is sort of a head back in a Western direction, granted one that isn't exactly Akimon style, but you can tell that they're sort of understanding their hybrid place. So we're almost done, so I can take questions, just to skim through these. It's just interesting that a couple of other, in a sort of hybrid East meets West ways, that the main one that I point out and what this slide is meant to represent is, like in 2000, Capcom was really struggling with the notion that this game that they had come to think of as a like broad-based pop culture phenomenon of a game, when, you know, Street Fighter 3 and even Third Strike did not culminate or did not like land with the mass market in the way that Street Fighter 2 did. I mean, they pulled the plug on Street Fighter, and it was interesting that they did this at the very time that, like, you know, Evo was taking flight, and, you know, the fighting game community as we know it was like launching elsewhere, and this was feedback they should have taken, and a few years later they managed to. But this is that sort of conversation they were used to thinking about selling X million copies of Street Fighter. When that stopped happening, you know, they needed to notice that this tournament scene existed, and eventually they did, and we now have the FGC, we have Street Fighter 4 and 5 that continue to sort of iterate in a way that I think better understands the brand. Really, I mean, we're not going to talk game balance or the price of DLC right now, but they do seem to understand the sort of hybrid visual style, and I mean, I can tell you that Nakayama-san is like obsessed with Street Fighter 2, and there are so many sort of visual Easter eggs in Street Fighter 5 that you'll never get because they're too random. No one will remember that this like egg pixel was hidden in the back of Sagat's stage, but anyway, he takes that stuff seriously. So there's Tim Laptino, the editor, and I playing Street Fighter, and now, after I get to the top screen, what questions can I answer? Yeah.
You mentioned Sakura being created to add an injection of playfulness and to Alpha. Was Dan Hibiki kind of the same way? And also there's rumor that Dan Hibiki was kind of meant as a kind of as a rib on like what SNK was doing over with Art of Fighting and that sort of thing.
It was totally a response to SNK. In fact, yeah, so much so that I think the Sakura comparison sort of works, and obviously those characters kind of work together in the Street Fighter mythos. I don't even know that Dan was meant to like balance the weight of the Alpha cast so much as like just being there as a joke that I mean, you can't make a character that weak. He doesn't balance anything, right?
He was also president in Alpha 1 before Argument's development too.
Yes, right, yeah, good point. And that rivalry between SNK and Capcom, which eventually obviously became friendly. They did their own series of crossovers, but yeah, that was fierce. Yeah.
Speaking of, the dark ages, if you will, like the odds and whatnot, when Capcom wasn't supporting all of this, would you be researching that for any sort of like future panel? Because that was actually a really interesting period, especially on the internet, where a lot of us were on forums like Short UK and Higher Voltage and, FighterSot way back. But...
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure where to chase that. I did have fun with the internet as it related to like sort of leading up to the original Battle by the Bay, because I liked that era of the internet. It was like all engineering students from around the country, because they were the only ones who had access to the internet, like trash talking about, this like combination of knowledge sharing, which was both meant to share knowledge but also demonstrate that you had the knowledge, which essentially led to the sort of trash talking. And one of my favorite interviews in the book is Yu-Ming Lee, because he was like the ultimate rabble rouser of that period. So it would be interesting to sort of chase this. It's like a generation farther in terms of the sophistication of the FGC, what you're talking about. And it would be interesting. Yeah, I'd love to get, and I didn't get the perspective of like what was Capcom thinking through those years, and did they kick it up the chain in 2001 and then decide no, we'll deal with this later. Obviously at some point they came around and they went to Seth Killian, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know. And I also know that a huge part of their thought process was that, Street Fighter like propped up arcades single-handedly for the few years of its arcade dominance, and then except for literal tournament play, it was tough to have a market for Street Fighter. So I sort of sold, I didn't do quite right by Capcom a minute ago, because there was a period when it was hard to create a Street Fighter game because you couldn't play online yet, and so that was the sort of online play facilitated modern console fighting gameplay, and they didn't wait too long after that to release Street Fighter 4. So, but yeah, if I could get those answers, I'd love to write like a feature article about it. Yeah.
So, knowing what you know now, do you feel like a lot of the development, like the Magic game, was due to luck, or do you think it was just really hard work and inspiration that you feel like they really went over a lot of iterations to get big on, or do you feel like they kind of made some
both. I think brilliant choices were made, especially early, and it's fun. We talk about the sort of CEO interference, and that didn't make a hit game. It was interesting how and in some ways, for those of us who I'm like both halves of creative, right? I'm a completely independent musician, so I make projects in that realm unfettered by a weird, irritating direction from anyone, and that works however it works, but I can't blame anyone else for it. But a project like this, or as a sort of journalist day-to-day taking direction from editors, you get these sort of off-the-wall constraints that often feel irritating, and I think that happened. That happens throughout this industry, especially AAA level, and you've got to sort of work within that sphere. And so, yeah, I think there were some like odd constraints put on these guys, and at some points that weighed them down, and at other points that sort of leads to creative decisions within that set that don't happen because of the constraint, but they sort of, maybe that sort of helped them come up with a creative insight that they wouldn't have otherwise had. But I do think it wasn't an accident. I think there's genius to it, and I mean that was back to like Acuman's trying to like simultaneously make the point of like I know that stuff was inappropriate, but I stand by it, and I would like you to know that it was that it was genius to deal with me. Yeah. Cue the house music, but I will answer questions. Thanks, guys, very much.